Alright internet, in this video I'm going to pitch you my sequel trilogy to the Batman. Not 2 movies to make a trilogy, but a whole 3-film trilogy. My thought process on this is if the Batman is the early, more grounded incarnation of the Caped Crusader, showing how he grew from vengeance to beacon of hope, then I can look at it almost like a prequel, and my trilogy pitch can tell the story fleshing out some of the more comic book elements of the world. Also because the climax I want to set up needs more than I can set up in a single sequel. But I digress. Now just to get this out of the way, I don't think I know better than Matt Reeves and the other talented people involved. I just want to have fun through this thought experiment and see if I can come up with a compelling, exciting Batman trilogy of my own. Let's do this. So, on top of making this a follow-up to Reeves' The Batman, I set up a few ground rules for this story pitch. I just can't do this the easy way, internet. I remember seeing rumors that Clayface was heavily considered to be the villain of the Reeves sequel, or at least one of the ideas being developed, so I'm not going to touch him. I also want to avoid Hush and the Court of Owls, as they feel like obvious choices for the grounded, Seven-inspired world. So, while all of that is dope, and I think there is setup for the Court of Owls coming up, my goal is to less continue what Reeves was doing, but to bridge the gap between the film's world and something with a bit more of a comic book vibe. I also want to introduce Robin, something the extremely grounded Nolan movies seemed against playing straight. I'm not going to do that right away, we'll get to Robin, but first we need to talk about For my first swing at widening out the world, I want to establish that Gotham, post the Riddler attack, has a new breed of criminal. Batman is protecting the still-soaked streets like he was at the beginning of the first film, but it is no longer from roaming gangs of criminals, but masked weirdos. No A-lister villains to start, but I think opening on Batman stopping a lower tier villain like Kite Man would really help establish Gotham's new world order. Even though Kite Man will only be in like the first 10 minutes, he will really set the stage for the shift. He won't be as flashy as his comic book counterpart or the animated version, but a crook with a glider is clearly a step up from the Riddler aesthetically, showing the events of the first film have had an effect on the city. Also, in this, I don't think Chuck Brown would call himself Kite Man, but that's what the cops and bureaucrats are calling him in a very mocking tone. Bruce, in this film, will still slowly be coming out of his shell. Early on, we'll see him making more appearances out in the daylight, mostly overseeing the charity work Wayne Enterprises has taken on to help rebuild the city. He doesn't want to be so hands-on, seeing it as a distraction from his work as Batman, but Alfred insists. In part because he wants Bruce to have a life outside of the mask, but also because he knows Bruce needs plausible deniability. The masked vigilante with expensive tech, stalking the streets at night, can't be the billionaire recluse if we see him out doing things all the time. You know, Batman shit. So, while all that is going on, we're introduced to the main villain, or at least his first crime scene. A lab has been broken into and trashed. Nothing physical was stolen, though many things have been destroyed. The computers have been wiped, clearly covering something up. The damage to the lab doesn't immediately flag the detectives as weird. Water damage is all too common since the flood, but Gordon thinks it's weird and calls in the Bat. They figure out that parts of the lab were frozen over and melted by the time the cops showed up. Mr. Freeze is one of my all-time favorite villains. I grew up watching Batman the Animated Series, so that shouldn't come as a surprise. I think that his episode Heart of Ice is a perfect story to be reinterpreted here. It can be used to tell a relatable, emotional human story, with his tech being the big leap forward that I want to make in the world. As they work the case, we get caught up on where Gordon is at this point in the story. He's trying to keep up with the new breed of crime in the city, but with so much of the force and other government officials being so corrupt, he feels like he's fighting a losing battle. The Batman as a film comes pretty close to beating the propaganda allegations a lot of superhero media dances with, and I want to address that here. Even as commissioner, Gordon and his circle are a tiny island in a sea of corruption, trying to fight a system built of corruption. If you want more insight on the Batman's relationship to propaganda, I'll leave Laron Reedus' excellent video on it in the description below. While putting together the pieces that point them to Mr. Freeze, he's stealing diamonds to power his machines, breaking into other GothCorp offices to get supplies, classic Mr. Freeze stuff. The Batman uncovers his secret identity and narrows down the search when he realizes they need to find locations that could house the equipment needed to keep Freeze's wife, Nora, alive. During all of this, Bruce finally comes around to the dual life he has to lead. While attending a charity event, he meets a young DA, Harvey Dent, who really feels like one of the good ones. Dent's career is at a bit of a standstill because he has been trying to break the corrupt status quo as much as he can. Bruce offers to set him up with the commissioner, someone Harvey hasn't been able to get in contact with on his own. I really liked how the Batman not only used the Riddler, but Penguin, Catwoman, and Falcone to flesh out the world. Batman as a character has a hell of a rogues gallery, and finding ways to include more of them without pulling too much focus from the main story is a big part of what I think matters here. That's why we have Kite Man at the beginning and why we're introducing Harvey as a supporting player. Unlike in The Dark Knight, we won't be doing the Two-Face origins here. In fact, he will never be a major villain. I see his arc playing in the background, showing him as a supporting player in the first two of my films, and already being established as Two-Face come the third. This lets us really feel for him as he falls from grace, but without dedicating a whole movie to it. I think that will set it apart from The Dark Knight and help emphasize that time is passing between movies. The climax of this film would need to be small and stripped down. The first one had a big brawl with Riddler goons, Batman needing to shoot adrenaline to win and handle it all, so to contrast that, I want a tense cat and mouse sequence. Freeze has the advantage with his tech, forcing Batman to use his stealth to survive as he figures out a way to win, highlighting Batman's problem-solving skills, elevating them from the first and showing how he's grown. Because at the end of the day, we're not just telling stories about Batman being awesome, we're telling stories about Batman growing. That's why you start with an early Batman so you can have an arc. You need room to spread things out. So far I haven't mentioned Catwoman, and there is a reason for that. I don't want to bring her back in this. She will come back down the line in the films, but I have plans for her in the interim. Just like how the Penguin has gotten a miniseries in between Batman films, I think it would be cool to do a Catwoman series after movie 2 to catch us up on her. I think that way we can have that big screen, small screen, shared universe they love, but by making the series limited events and doing one between each film will hopefully keep audiences from being oversaturated by it as a whole. As for the plot for a Catwoman series, I think a classic heist told across a few episodes would be cool. Let me know if you want a whole video on that. I don't have one completely worked out, and I know there's a lot of comics that I could pull from for a story like that, but the point I want to make is, at some point in her story, she will send a message to Batman, and what she says won't be revealed until the next Batman film. So with part 2, we expanded on the world of Gotham by including Mr. Freeze. A part of me wants to keep doing so with the inclusion of other, less grounded characters, and I want to keep going on that path, but we also need to expand the world's scope. In particular, this is where we will be introducing Robin. A part of me initially wanted to do a loose reworking of the Batman comic Dark Victory. It is a follow-up to The Long Halloween, a book that was one of the major inspirations on the first Reeves film. I think after a big villain like Freeze going back to a sprawling mystery, now with Robin by his side, could be really interesting, highlighting how much growth there has been, and how having a young sidekick affects how Batman works. The issue here is one of the major players in the book, Sophia Falcone, is a major player in the Penguin series that is currently airing as I'm writing this. I currently don't know what the fate of this character is, or how much that show will, if at all, pull from Dark Victory. It seems to be a light reworking of that, or set after her version of that. Whatever it is, we gotta write off Dark Victory as a loose source. So instead, let's do ManBat. I love the idea of Matt Reeves doing his own take on a monster movie, throwing back to his horror roots. Horror as a genre has its fingerprints all over the Batman, and I think that going all in on that would be great. I think that a version of ManBat, essentially playing off the tragedy of the Jekyll and Hyde style story, would fit right in. Not only for the horror, but for the doomed gothic love story of Dr. Kirk Langstrom and his wife, Dr. Francine Langstrom, being torn apart when he becomes a monster, is something that can play really well. We could even go with her, in the final act, turning herself into She-Bat, just so that way they can be together, only for their creature forms to turn on each other, driven by instinct and taking each other out. I also think that tragic, horrific love story would be an excellent story to tell along with the story of introducing Robin and Bruce learning to care about and be responsible for someone else. I think Dick Grayson is an important part of stating who Batman is. Having Bruce take in a young ward, who I would age up to like 15, 16 in this, softens him, giving him something to care about. But by allowing this boy to become his sidekick, it shows the skewed way Batman views the world and his war on crime. I see Dick being brought to Wayne Manor after the death of his parents by Harvey, who thinks Bruce could be the one to take him in. Bruce is reluctant at first, seeing the boy as an obstacle to his work, but Alfred would convince him and encourage them to connect over the course of the film. I think this is also important because we need parts of the story to be how Bruce can make a difference, not just as the Bat. We highlight that in the macro in the previous film, with Wayne Enterprises funding the rebuild of Gotham, and in the micro here, helping a single person in need. Dick will obviously discover the Batcave and eventually prove himself to be worthy of joining Batman out in the field, where he makes his own costume and rescues Bruce in the third act just before the Langstroms take each other out. Doing it this way allows us to avoid Bruce dragging a kid with him to fight a literal monster, but also highlights the way Robin is an asset capable in his own right. So while all this is going on, I want a subplot where Harvey and Gordon team up to investigate the death of the Grayson family. The deaths have been ruled an accident, but that doesn't sit right with Dent, who thinks something else is going on. He brings the commissioner with him, as he's the only member of Gotham PD he trusts, to look into it, and honestly to validate his own research a little. The important thing here is this plotline will end in disappointment. Despite some potential leads and Harvey refusing to give up, there is no way to prove that this wasn't anything more than an accident, a freak chance event. The point of the story is to do two things. The first is to sow a divide between Gordon and Dent. Despite the massive respect they have for each other, not being able to prove Harvey's hunch to be true will put a pressure on between them. Come the end of the movie, the commissioner is done, ready to call it quits. But Harvey insists they keep going. He proposes they flip a coin. If heads, they keep at it. If tails, it's over. But Gordon refuses, turning his back on his friend and walking away, not even looking at the results. This will cause Harvey to question himself and should be a moment of foreshadowing both for the character's darker path and the binary view he will develop on how he makes his choices. This obviously won't be the first time we see Harvey tossing a coin. After all, this is his second film, but it will be the first time he wants to leave so much on the results of a single toss. The second reason this plot matters is because it will, again, allow us to fill the world with hints towards more of the rogues gallery. Seeing conversations with incarcerated villains in Arkham like Solomon Grundy, future ones like Victor Crane or Harleen Quinzel, not only let the world feel full, but sets up my plans for the final film in my pitch. But before we get to that, I want to pitch another story for TV. Both the show that already exists, The Penguin, and my earlier Catwoman pitch have been villain-focused, along with the cancelled Arkham series. I love that, as it lets us give what often aren't point-of-view characters in superhero movies their time to shine in ways that we rarely get to see. That said, I want to spotlight a hero with this one, giving a miniseries to Robin. This lets us flesh the character out more and gives him the chance to grow between his introduction in the previous film, letting him have fully come into his own by the next one. We can also make this a way to introduce future young Bat family members like Barbara Gordon or Stephanie Brown and others, either making them characters right away or just teasing them as Easter eggs for later. Like the Catwoman bit, I don't want to spend too much time on this, I just like the idea of the series existing in between films to keep us fed so the movies can take their time. For the final film in this pitch, I want to take all the pieces I've been laying on the board and finally put them into play with a story that uses the wide range of villains as a massive ensemble, taking inspiration, at least lightly, from the comic The War of Jokes and Riddles. As a casual comics fan, I discovered this story after the Batman came out, looking into what they could do with both the Riddler and Joker together after the scene they share in the first film. I loved the idea of warring factions, each rallied behind one of two insane, larger-than-life figures, each hoping to be the one to kill the Batman. That's why, despite wanting each of the other films to be able to stand on their own and not feel like they are just set up for the next one, I put an emphasis on introducing the Rogues Gallery at large, so that way we can have an array of minor players to pull from in this finale. The first act will actually have Joker and Riddler working together, rallying the Arkham inmates together to make their escape. This will also give us a chance to reintroduce the Joker, and I want to do so in a more toned down version than how we first saw him. Pull out some of that clear Heath Ledger inspiration because it feels a little played out at this point, and sprinkle in a bit of the darker side of the animated series Joker to balance out the character. Once they do, there is a fallout between them, and the rest of the film will be following the ensuing war they wage on not only each other, but the entire city. Because of this, we can have the Riddler reinvent himself from loser terrorist to what he thinks would be a charismatic leader to these insane criminals. Again, bridging the gap to the comics, while keeping the core of this version of the character. This pretty much turns the second half of the movie into a series of creative action sequences, Batman fending off strange combinations of different rogues coming after him, but also targeting each other. I see this as an insane dash to defeat them all, essentially in one night, before either the Joker or Riddler can get off their plans to destroy Gotham. Batman obviously can't do this all on his own, or even just with Robin, but over the course of these films, he's built a roster of allies. Gordon, a returning Catwoman, and even introducing Batgirl, highlighting his growth from solo vigilante to hero, the one he began at the beginning of the series with the first film, and has been developing in different ways in each subsequent film. At least that's how I'm pitching it. Thank you so much for watching. I loved The Batman when it came out, and while I'm looking forward to whatever it is Reeves cooks up next, I needed to let my imagination run wild for a bit with this. I also wish I could have covered Poison Ivy in some way, but I just didn't find room to fit her in without coming up with an entire other film, and as is, pitching 3 films felt like a lot to do, but I would love to see a version of her in this kind of world. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, and until next time, have a good one.